Good morning, everyone. And it's good to see you all here today. So before I forget it, I want to mention that this is the last Saturday in July. And during August, um, Carol and I are going to be taking a sabbatical of sorts. So Eric suggested that perhaps uh, uh, someone else could host the meeting informally, have kind of an informal session on Saturdays during this time slot in August. And um, Peggy agreed to do that, to perform that function for the first and fourth Saturday in August. I believe that's the 5th and the 26th of August. But she cannot do that during the middle two Saturdays in August. I mention this in part in case there is anyone who has a hosting account on Zoom and would be interested in serving that function during those two middle Saturdays in August. In which case, you could contact Peggy and she can give you full information about how to do it. So, and if no one does serve that function, then there just won't be sessions for those two Saturdays in the middle of August. But if you have interest in doing this, and don't be afraid, it won't be hard. You can contact Peggy and she will help you out. So that being said, last last week we talked about some of the misconceptions about meditation. Meditation is certainly a hot topic now in popular culture, even though it's it's kind of hard to define what meditation is. Scholars have difficulty agreeing on what constitutes meditation, since there are such a wide range of activities that are called meditation in various cultures, various traditions around the world. So we won't be taking the topic of defining meditation on, but I would like to today talk a little bit about specifically Zazen. And if we don't have these misconceptions about what Zazen can offer or what it is, then what exactly is it? So oftentimes in Soto Zen centers, there's kind of a mystery about what Zazen is, and oftentimes the instructions are fairly brief, like, well, just sit up straight and let go of thoughts, and just do it. Just sit up straight and sit upright and let go of thoughts. Sit still. And if you don't understand it, just do it some more, and it will become clear. And that is quite possibly true. And that may be a reasonable way to guide people, but it does call upon them to have a fair amount of faith in the practice, probably more than many people can muster. There are some descriptions about Zazen. Many of them have to do with the physical aspects of Zazen, how you're supposed to sit. Some of them are quite detailed, recommending sitting in a particular way, either full lotus or half lotus, and which foot you put on which thigh first, and that sort of thing, and whether your tongue is pressed against your palate, whether your eyes are open or closed. A lot of detail, and particularly detail about the body's posture. And I think all of that is helpful and important, particularly some aspects. I don't personally think that it is critical to be in a lotus or half lotus position, particularly if that causes pain, as it does for most people in the West. I certainly have reached a point in my life where that sort of positioning of my legs just doesn't work for me anymore. But the instruction about being upright, being balanced, and with the head raised high, all of that, I think, has some importance. It is true that the mind is affected by the position, the posture of the body. There's no question about it. But I would like to focus a little bit beyond that today on, well, what do you do with the mind? Okay, you've got your body in position as best you can, and very few people have perfect posture, but you do the best you can, and then and you try to stay still, and very few people can stay perfectly still, but you do the best you can. But what about the mind? Because it still runs, it still generates thoughts, it still hears things, and ruminates sometimes. So what do you do with that? And here's where the instruction gets kind of sketchy. In the Soto Zen tradition, the founder being Eihei Dogen, 13th century Japanese Zen teacher, he devoted, of course, a lot of attention to Zazen, and there was a description or what's called universal way of Zazen, Fukan Zazenji, which he composed upon returning from his 4 years in China, where he studied with a teacher there. And then he continued to revise during the course of his lifetime. And in specifically talking about what to do with the mind during Zazen, in the early version of the Fukan Zazenji, he uses a passage that he got really from an earlier Chinese Zen teacher, writing that was available to him at the time that he was studying in China. And it's fairly prosy. It says, when thought arises, be aware of it. When you are aware of it, it will disappear. Put aside everything outside continuously and make yourself into one piece, Piece. When thought arises, be aware of it, and it will disappear. Make yourself into one piece and just keep doing that. That's fairly comprehensible. But he revised this later in the final version of the Fukan Zazenji. That passage is replaced with this one. Think of non-thinking. How is this done? By thinking beyond thinking and not thinking. Think of non-thinking. How is this done? By thinking beyond thinking and not thinking. Well, that's not as obvious, is it? What is he talking about? Here he is referring to a story about a teacher and a monk. There are many such stories in Zen. And this refers to the teacher, Yaoshan, who was a Tang Dynasty Zen teacher in China, very well known, and one of his students. And Yaoshan was sitting in meditation, and a student came to him and asked a question. He said, "What are you thinking when you are sitting there steadfast as a mountain? What are you thinking when you're sitting there steadfast as a mountain?" And Yaoshan said, "I'm thinking of not thinking." And the student, the monk, said, "How do you think of not thinking?" And Yaoshan said, "Non-thinking." The words in for thinking, not thinking, and non-thinking are distinct in Japanese as they are in English. Shro being thinking, Fushro being not thinking, and Hishro being non-thinking. Sometimes these are translated not as thinking, not thinking, and non-thinking, but rather as fathoming, not fathoming, and non-fathoming, or fathomless, fathomless. Because they have a meaning of measuring about them, fathoming. Sometimes it's translated as thought measuring. It's referring to, I'm sure, the discursive mind that measures things, compares things, says this is better than that, or otherwise. Fathoming or not fathoming. Replaced by fathomless. Dogen often says that the way to nirvana, to awakening, to enlightenment, to discovery of the truth, is through samsara, through our delusions, through our dualistic mind. And perhaps through just observing the activity of this mind, this deluded mind, constantly comparing, favoring or disfavoring, observing that activity with cool recollection, with cool attention, I should say, allows us to get beyond that to the mind that is always present and pre-existed the discursive mind, the mind of simple awareness. So there's a passage I would like to read to expand on this a bit. In Japan, there was a Zen teacher, no longer living, but contemporary, recent 20th century, who was born in 1912, which turned out to be the end of the Meiji period in Japan. The Meiji period was a time of intense exploration of Western culture. The emperor at that time was convinced that Japan needed to modernize, as we might call it. So it went from a predominantly agrarian, almost feudal culture to a modern industrial culture in an extremely short period of time, starting around 1870 or though, and going up until the early 1900s. And they went at it. The Japanese went at it with great vigor. They had thousands of consultants come from Europe to give them advice about how to industrialize and how and teach them about the culture in the West. And people would travel to Europe in order to learn how to do things that they did in Europe, including a man named Suzuki, who went to Germany during that time to learn how to build violins. He was a luthier in Japan who wanted to know how to make Western instruments. And many of you are familiar with the Suzuki violin method, which has become sort of a standard in the West now. But in any case, this teacher, Uchiyama, Kosho Uchiyama, was born in 1912 and was a continuing part of this exploration of Western culture. And he went to study at a university there. He got a master's degree in Western philosophy. And then was ordained a monk in 1941 and was abbot of a monastery there, Taiji, rather, for 10 years before he retired. But he attracted a great number of Western students, and he was very much interested in trying to explain Zazen to Westerners with his education in Western culture, in Western literature, Western traditions. He wanted to take advantage of that to try to explain this to Westerners in a way that they could understand. And he wrote a number of books, including a one that is now rather obscure, but I happen to have a copy of. It's called Approach to Zen. And I'd like to read a little section from that. May I just mention first, though, that I've told you a little bit about Uchiyama's life, but there's so much more to tell. Um, before he was ordained, he was married twice. The first time, his wife died of tuberculosis shortly after they were married, and his second wife died in childbirth along with his only child. So he had a very difficult and tumultuous youth. And it was further complicated by the fact that this was a time when Japan was developing imperial aspirations and was attacking China and was getting involved in the Second World War. Uchiyama had tuberculosis through much of his life, through all of his youth and into adulthood. He was unfit for military service, but the only way he could avoid military service was to perform useful activities during the war. So he was, as a monk, assigned to a charcoal plant and then a desalination plant where they got sea salt for anyway. He lived almost all of his life in what we would consider abject poverty. He writes this: "The reality of life is beyond my idea of myself as a small individual. The basic fact is that the self, with a capital S, is living out non-dual life, which pervades all living things and everything which exists. On the other hand, we usually lose sight of the reality of the light, of the life, rather, of the capital S self. By having this idea of ourselves as small individuals, we cause the capital S self to be clouded over. And if we now let go of our thoughts, this reality of life becomes pure and clear. Zazen is to live out this reality of life as it is. That is, to wake up, to do non-thinking. At this very point, our basic attitude in practicing Zazen becomes definite. The attitude is doing Zazen as Mahayana Buddhism is never to try and produce artificially some new self by means of practice, nor are we aiming at decreasing delusion and finally eliminating it altogether. In Zazen, we neither aim at having a special mystical experience, nor do we try to gain greater enlightenment. Zazen, as true Mahayana Buddhism, is always the big self, just truly being the big self. Life truly being life. Naturally, we have eyes, but if we close our eyes and say that the world is absolutely dark, then we aren't living out the reality of life. If we open our eyes, the sun is shining brilliantly. In the same way, when we live with our eyes which see life wide open, we find out that we are living in the vigorous light of life. Although we always make the light of the universal self foggy and dull because of the clouds, which are the ideas of our small self, we can open our eyes to the vital life of the capital S self by doing Zazen and letting go of these ideas. In other words, when we believe that the truth of our small individual self is the capital S self and practice the reality of life, do Zazen, then we have the attitude of Zazen as true Buddhism. So, so that was one of Uchiyama's attempts at trying to explain Zazen to the discursive Western mind. One last thing I'll read before we stop for breakouts is from another obscure book that I happened to find at a book fair many years ago, and this is also a contemporary work. It's by it's 20th century anyway, by Herbert Wone. It's called The Simplicity of Playing the Violin. And I think the parallels may be of interest here. The idea he's talking about just the attention, how to pay attention during practice. The idea of getting to grips with or getting one's teeth into a problem should also be abandoned. Such an attitude precludes attention, which is essentially light and unaggressive. It also involves the body in tensions and extravagances that have no value in the solving of a technical problem. Attention is holding of awareness from moment to moment upon a given point. It is not the screwing up of the forehead or the gritting of the teeth in intense effort. In this sense, attention is closely related to that part of the deepest level within a human being, which is able detachedly to observe the activities going on within his or her organism. This observer is an unbiased eye which does not identify with a situation and is able to hold full consciousness of it. It is, in fact, the eternal lying behind and within all people, a treasure rarely uncovered because of external and temporal pressures in life. So we'll stop there. I went on a little longer than I intended, and I wonder if there are questions that this raises, or if there are questions about Zazen that you've been afraid to ask and might be willing to discuss in the breakout rooms, and then we can get back together and see if we can help one another. So thank you for listening today, and we'll stop there.